The road stretched out in a haze of dust, shimmering under a sun that beat down like a hammer on an anvil. It was the kind of heat that baked the hope right out of you, pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck until you forgot which way was forward. Loretta walked it barefoot. Her shoes were a distant memory, sacrificed to the miles behind her. Her dress, once a soft blue, was now a colorless, torn gray rag. In her arms, she held the only thing in the world that mattered. Her daughter. Swaddled in a shawl that was more whole than fabric, the baby's soft breath was the only rhythm that kept Loretta tethered to this world. Every single step felt like a bet against the devil himself. Yet she clung to a sliver of hope, a desperate prayer that somewhere up this God-forsaken road there might be a scrap of mercy left. She hadn't really slept in days. How could she? The moment she closed her eyes, the shadows came for her. She saw her in-laws, their faces twisted into sneering masks of hatred. She saw their hands reaching for her child, ready to smother the life from her before it had even truly begun. She could still hear the venomous hiss of her sister-in-law's voice, spitting the word "cursed" like a poison dart aimed at her infant's heart. That night wasn't just a memory, it was a brand seared into her very soul. She had fled into the pitch-black darkness, the baby clutched to her chest so tight she feared she might break her. The only sound in the world was the ragged, tearing sound of her own breathing. Since that moment, rejection had become her shadow, a hungry dog snapping at her heels. She had begged, oh how she had begged. On porches, at back doors, in kitchens that smelled of bread she would never taste. She even tried the church, thinking God's house would offer sanctuary. But every door slammed shut just as fast as it opened. The townfolk whispered behind their hands as she passed. They saw a widow carrying her shame like a scar, a woman who should have bent her head, accepted her fate, and gone back to her kin. But Loretta had made a promise to the tiny life in her arms. Her baby would never again sleep under the roof of murderers. She would walk until her feet bled, she would starve, but she would not go back. Never. And that's when she saw it. Through the shimmering heat, a shape began to form. A ranch, sitting on the far edge of the valley. Fences stretched out like a skeleton's ribs, holding in a herd of cattle that moved in slow, ponderous motion. And at the heart of it all, a man. He stood bare-armed and sunburnt, swinging an axe into thick logs of wood. The force of each blow cracked the air, a sound like bone snapping. His movements were practiced, relentless, each swing landing with a brutal finality that made Loretta's tired legs hesitate. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders as broad as a barn door. His face was set in a permanent scowl, made even more menacing by a jagged scar that cut a white line across his jaw. This was the kind of man the town whispered about. Angry, dangerous, a man best left alone. Still, she took a step forward. Then another. Dust clung to her eyelashes, and her throat was so dry her voice came out as a cracked whisper. "Sir," she said, the word barely disturbing the air. I only ask for work, a corner of your barn, anywhere. My baby needs to rest." The man froze mid-swing, the axe head buried deep in a block of wood. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, cold as a winter sky, narrowed on her. He took in the whole sorry picture. The torn dress, the exhaustion carved into her face, the frail arms holding the tiny bundle against her chest. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick as a judge's verdict. Finally, his voice came, low and edged with steel. "I don't take in strays." He paused, his eyes flicking from her to the baby. "Not women, not children." The words stung, sharp and cold, though Loretta had braced herself for them. She lowered her gaze, her arms tightening instinctively around her daughter. "Then let me work for nothing," she pleaded, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I can mend fences. I can fetch water. Clean. Will be no trouble to you." His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. With a grunt, he yanked the axe free from the log, set another one in its place, and split it clean through with a single, violent motion. Best turn back to your people, he growled. Don't come dragging your burdens here. A sound escaped Loretta's lips. It was almost a laugh, but it trembled and broke, more like a sob. My people, she said, her voice shaking with a bitter irony, tried to bury my child before she'd even drawn her first full breath. There is no turning back for me. For a split second something flickered in his hard face. Something human. Something that looked almost like pain before it was quickly shuttered away. He reached for another log, his big hands rough against the bark, but then his hand stilled. The baby, disturbed by the tension, began to stir. A thin, reedy cry broke the silence, a sound so soft yet piercing in the vast open air. Loretta immediately began to rock her, humming a tuneless, broken lullaby, her own voice trembling. The sound of that tiny cry seemed to strike the man harder than any axe ever could. His gaze lingered, drawn against his will to the tiny, perfect hand that pushed its way free of the shawl, its little fingers curling toward the light as if reaching for something it couldn't see. He muttered something under his breath, a curse maybe, or a prayer. He set the axe down with a thud that seemed to echo his own reluctance. Barn's empty, he bit out, not looking at her. One night. He turned his head just enough for her to hear him clearly. You hear me? Relief washed over Loretta so powerfully it was like rain after a lifetime of drought. Her knees felt weak. She nodded quickly, unable to form words. Thank you, sir. Thank you. He didn't answer. He turned his back on her and retreated toward the small cabin, his shoulders stiff and straight, as if he regretted his words the very moment they left his mouth. Loretta didn't wait. She hurried to the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of gratitude. She stepped into the cool, shadowed space that smelled of rich earth and old hay. She found a clean pile of straw and gently laid her baby down, brushing the dust from her impossibly small cheeks with the corner of her ragged shawl. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her daughter's face softened into peace, her little lips parting in quiet sleep. Loretta's own knees finally buckled. She sank down beside her daughter, pressing her palms together in a silent, desperate prayer of thanks. The old barn roof groaned in the wind, and shafts of late-afternoon sun slipped through the cracks in the wood, painting her child's sleeping face in stripes of gold. Loretta whispered promises only the rafters could hear. She would endure any shame, any hunger, any hardship, so long as that tiny chest kept rising and falling. She would burn the world down to keep her safe. From the window of his cabin, the man watched. Jasper. His arms were folded tight across his chest, his mouth a hard, unforgiving line. Yet his eyes lingered on the barn door longer than he meant them to. He had sworn off women. He had sworn off kindness. He had sworn off any connection to the human race long ago, back when trusting someone had left him with scars that ran far deeper than the one that marked his jaw. But something about the sight of that child, so fragile and yet so unyielding in its simple will to live, was chipping away at the edges of his armor. He told himself it was just pity, nothing more. A weakness he would stamp out by morning. He turned away from the window, his own reflection in the dark glass showing a stranger he barely recognized. Back in the barn, Loretta lay back on the straw, the bone-deep exhaustion finally claiming her. The baby stirred once, a soft sigh, then nestled deeper into a world of dreams. Loretta's eyes fluttered shut, but a knot of unease kept her heart racing. She had bought them one night of shelter. Just one. Tomorrow could bring more rejection, more slammed doors, more danger. But for now, for this single, precious night, the world was hushed. Her daughter was breathing steady and safe beside her, and she allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous sip of rest. The air grew thick with the scent of dust and hay. Outside, the cattle lowed softly, and then the sound of wood splitting echoed across the yard again. It was a rhythm she couldn't escape, sharp, final, and unforgiving. Yet in the long pause between each strike, she imagined, just for a moment, that the silence held a question, unspoken, waiting for her answer. The barn smelled of earth and old hay, the air still and cool before the dawn. Loretta woke with a start, her bones aching from the hard straw bed. The baby stirred against her side, tiny fists curling and uncurling, and Loretta pressed a soft kiss to her forehead before she carefully rose. The ranch stretched out wide and silent under a pale gray sky, the dew glistening on the grass like a carpet of tiny diamonds. The fences ran on, like ribs pushing out into the horizon. She took a deep breath, gathered what was left of her courage, and went to the pump. She filled a heavy wooden bucket, the iron handle cold against her skin, and carried it to the trough. Her steps were unsteady, but her purpose was firm. She would earn her keep, even if it was just for one day. From his cabin window, Jasper saw her. He'd been up for hours, the same way he was every day, but he hadn't expected the woman to wake so early. He certainly hadn't expected her to set herself to chores without being asked. He poured black coffee into a tin mug, the liquid hot and bitter, and watched as she hauled a second bucket of water. Then he saw her bend to gather fallen rails by the corral, her movements slow but determined. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, and for a moment he could see the sharp bones of her collar, the sheer weariness carved into the curve of her spine. He told himself she wouldn't last. By sundown, she'd be gone, just like all the others who'd tried to beg a place on his land. But there was something in her quiet persistence that unsettled him, like a stone pressing in his boot that he couldn't shake loose. When Loretta returned to the barn, her child had woken and was crying, a thin, hungry sound. She lifted her gently, her body aching, and began whispering lullabies, her voice raw from disuse. The baby soon quieted against her breast, and Loretta sat back on the straw, closing her eyes in a moment of profound relief. That's when she heard the heavy crunch of boots on the dirt outside. Jasper stood in the open doorway, a tall, dark shadow cut against the rising sun. "You don't owe me work," he said, his voice gruff, almost angry. "I told you one night. No more." Loretta's throat tightened, the fragile hope from the morning threatening to crumble. "I won't stay idle," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not when there's breath in me." His brow furrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He said nothing more. He just turned and strode back to the yard, the conversation left hanging in the air, weighted with something she couldn't possibly name. Through the long, hot day, she kept at it. She found lengths of old rope and used them to mend a sagging gate. She swept the barn aisle until the packed earth was clean. She scrubbed the water pail until it shone. Her hands, soft from weeks of doing nothing but holding her baby, began to blister. But she hid the pain, curling her fingers into her palms. She was determined to prove her worth, to prove she wasn't just another burden. At noon, she saw Jasper sitting beneath the shade of a large oak tree by the corral. He was sharpening a long knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the air. As she walked by, her baby on her hip, the infant let out a soft gurgle and reached a tiny hand toward him, small fingers twitching in the bright sunlight. Jasper's eyes met Loretta's over the baby's head, and for the briefest of moments, his hard, scarred face faltered. He sheathed the knife abruptly, stood, and walked away without a word. The thing about small towns, though, is that secrets don't stay secret for long. Whispers travel faster than a wildfire. By afternoon, a man delivering salt blocks to the ranch pulled Jasper aside. "You best keep your distance from that widow," the man muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the barn. "Bad luck clings to her like a shroud. Her kinfolk say she's cursed. And the town, well, folks don't want her kind raising a child out here." Jasper only grunted in reply, his face giving nothing away. But the man's words clung to him like burrs, sharp and irritating. He knew the man wasn't just reporting gossip. It was a warning, a clear and simple warning. The town was watching. That night, Jasper sat alone in his cabin, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. The fire snapped and crackled in the hearth, but it offered no warmth. His thoughts kept wandering out to the barn, to the faint sound of soft humming that drifted across the dark yard. He remembered another woman, a long time ago. He remembered her lies, sweet as honey but laced with poison. He remembered the betrayal that had cut him so deep it had left him a loner, a man with a jagged scar on his face and a wall of ice around his heart. He cursed under his breath and took a long swallow of whiskey, the liquid burning a trail down his throat. Yet no matter how hard he tried to harden himself, no matter how much he drank, the faint cry of the baby threaded through the silence, finding its way into the cracks of his resolve. Loretta didn't sleep much that night either. She sat awake in the darkness, stroking her daughter's fine hair, her mind a frantic storm of fears. The faces of her in-laws haunted her, their threats still echoing in her ears. She knew them. They were not people who gave up. Her child represented shame to them, a stain on their family name, a life they had already decided should be erased. She shivered, clutching her baby closer. Every creak of the old barn timbers sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind whispering through the walls sounded like their voices, calling for her, hunting her. The safety she felt was an illusion, thin as smoke. And she had a terrible, sinking feeling that she had brought the danger right to the doorstep of the one man who had shown her any kindness. Morning broke with a heat that was already pressing down on the land. Loretta carried her baby on one hip as she walked toward the corral. In her other hand, she held a small pan of cornbread she'd baked over a tiny fire, using the last of the flour she had bartered for in a town days ago. She found Jasper leaning on the fence, watching his cattle move like slow, brown shadows in the morning dust. "For thanks," she said quietly, offering him a piece. He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Then he took it. The bread was coarse and rough-edged, but it was warm. He ate it without a word of comment, though she saw his eyes linger on her longer than he intended. The baby gurgled happily, reaching out a sticky hand to touch his beard. Jasper stiffened, pulling back as if he'd been stung. His scowl deepened, a mask slamming back into place, erasing the brief moment of connection. By midday, Loretta knew she had to risk it. She walked the long mile into town to fetch salt and a bit of cloth. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground in front of her. But the whispers pricked at her ears all the same. Women at the mercantile huddled together, their voices dropping as she passed. "Shameless," one whispered, clinging to that man like a burr. Another man muttered that Jasper was a fool, that he would live to regret harboring her, that she brought nothing but trouble wherever she went. Loretta ignored them, lifting her chin just enough to show she still had a scrap of dignity left, even as her stomach churned with acid. She bought what little she could afford, then turned for the ranch, her steps quickened by a growing sense of unease. The town felt like a pot of water, slowly, surely, coming to a boil. When she returned, Jasper was repairing a wagon wheel by the shed. His gaze flicked from the small bundle of supplies in her arms to the tension etched on her face. "Trouble?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a command. "Only words," she answered softly, not wanting to burden him further. He grunted, setting his tools aside with a clatter. Words can cut deeper than any knife. For a moment, a heavy silence stretched between them, thick with all the things they weren't saying. Then he picked up the heavy wheel and carried it to the wagon, dismissing her as if the matter was of no consequence. Yet Loretta saw it. She saw the faint crease in his brow, the way his jaw worked as though he were grinding his teeth against an unseen stone. He was more troubled by the town's words than he was letting on. And that scared her more than anything. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jasper paused by the barn door. He watched Loretta lay her baby down, his eyes unseen in the growing dusk. He saw her brush a kiss over her tiny cheek. The shawl slipped again, and in the dim light he noticed how truly gaunt her shoulders were, how exhaustion hung on her like a second skin. He almost spoke. He almost told her she had to leave, for her own good, before the town's whispers turned into something sharper, something more dangerous. But the words got stuck in his throat. He couldn't make them come out. Instead, he just stepped back into the gathering darkness, the conflict unresolved, tearing him apart from the inside. Loretta sat in the barn, her daughter asleep in her arms, her eyes tracing the thin cracks of light along the walls. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the faint, fragile outline of safety. It was as fragile as a spider's web, and she knew the mercy this strange, angry man had given her could vanish with a single word. Yet when she looked at her child sleeping, her little mouth curved in peaceful surrender. She vowed she would hold on to this small corner of rest with everything she had. Outside, the cicadas began their nightly chorus, the sound rising and falling. Jasper stood by the fence, his silhouette a dark shape against the dying light, watching the horizon. He told himself again he would send her away tomorrow. First thing. But then, through the silence, her voice carried on the wind, a lullaby so soft and uncertain it seemed to thread its way through the darkness and right into his chest. His hand tightened on the wooden rail, his breath catching in his throat, before he forced himself to look away. The night deepened, and in the barn, Loretta whispered to her daughter, "We'll be safe, little one. Somehow." The promise trembled in the air, as if daring the world to try and break it. The morning sun bled into the valley with a harsh, unforgiving light, the kind that seemed to expose every weakness a person tried to hide. Loretta wrapped her baby close and began the long walk into town. She drew her shawl tight around her shoulders, though the air was already thick with oppressive warmth. Each step was heavy with a familiar dread. She needed cloth, a little milk, maybe a handful of flour if she could manage it. More than that, she needed to keep her head held high, even though she knew the whispers would be trailing behind her like smoke. At the mercantile, the air was thick with judgment. A group of women clustered near the barrels of dried beans, leaning close to each other, their voices low but sharp as knives. "That widow again," one of them muttered, not bothering to hide her disdain. "It's shameful, just walking onto a man's ranch uninvited." Another one smirked. "Her kind never stays long. That hard-faced cowboy will throw her out by week's end, you mark my words." Loretta kept her chin steady, though her stomach felt like it was full of twisting snakes. She placed her few coins on the counter for the cloth and a small tin of milk. The shopkeeper's eyes, for half a breath, seemed to hold a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished when he glanced at the other customers. He gave her less change than she was owed. She knew it, but she said nothing. She just slid the purchases into her basket and walked out. The streets outside hummed with idle, cruel talk. A pair of men leaned against the hitching post, their laughter bitter and loud. "Jasper's a fool to keep her," one of them said. "Or maybe," the other one drawled, "he's just that desperate." Loretta walked past them, her shoulders squared, refusing to let them see her falter, but each word was like a splinter lodging itself deep under her skin. By the time she reached the familiar outline of the ranch, her breath was shallow, and her resolve was frayed down to a single thin thread. Jasper was at the corral when she returned, his hammer driving nails into a fence post with powerful, measured strokes. His eyes immediately caught the tightness in her face, the way she held her body as if expecting a blow. He didn't ask at first. He just kept working, the rhythmic banging echoing the tension in the air. Finally he stopped and muttered without looking at her. "They said something, didn't they?" "Words," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Nothing more." His jaw tightened, and he slammed another nail into the wood with a single furious blow. "Words can rot a soul faster than a drought," he grunted. He still didn't look at her, but the sheer force of his anger was clear in the rigid set of his shoulders. It was an anger that wasn't directed at her, she realized with a start. It was for her. The days that followed stretched out, each one marked by small, unspoken gestures that neither of them would ever admit to noticing. One morning, Jasper left an extra pail of fresh water by the barn door. The next afternoon, Loretta swept his porch clean without being asked. One night, he sat by the light of his lantern and mended the baby's torn shawl, his big, rough fingers clumsy and awkward with the needle and thread. He never said a word about it. But when she found it the next day, folded neatly by the stall, she pressed the mended fabric to her lips in silence, a wave of emotion so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. Then, one evening, a hard rain swept across the valley. It wasn't a storm, not enough to break fences, but it was a steady, insistent drumming against the roofs, like 1,000 restless hands. The old barn leaked. Water dripped down in a dozen places. Without ceremony, Jasper appeared at the door. "Can't have the little one soaked," he said, his voice gruff as always. He called her into the cabin. She hesitated for only a moment, then stepped over the threshold, clutching her child tight. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and iron. The cabin was spare, almost barren, but it was clean and orderly. She sat in a rough-hewn chair near the fire, rocking the baby and humming a tune her own mother used to sing to her. Jasper poured himself a glass of whiskey, but she saw his hand tremble slightly as he lifted it to his lips. The sound of her quiet humming filled the small room, a fragile, haunting melody against the backdrop of the drumming rain. He stared into the fire, his face a mask, but she could see the memories burning there. She imagined another woman's laughter, a sharp knife of betrayal, and the long, lonely years of solitude he had chosen as his penance. He gritted his teeth, visibly forcing the ghosts back into the dark corners of his mind. Loretta glanced at him, her face illuminated by the fire's glow, her eyes tired but impossibly steady. "You've given us more than we deserve," she said quietly. He shifted in his chair, unsettled by her directness. "Don't mistake pity for kindness," he bit out. She shook her head slowly, smoothing the baby's fine hair. "It doesn't matter what name you give it," she replied softly. "To us, it is life." A thick, heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of the rain. Jasper's chest rose sharply, as if he were about to say something, but no words came. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the ground slick and shining, the air washed clean. Loretta stepped outside to hang the baby's damp blanket on the fence. Her hair was still damp, her dress clinging to her thin frame. Jasper watched her from the porch, his arms folded across his chest. Something in his gaze lingered a moment too long, a look she couldn't decipher, but he forced it away the instant she turned toward him. That same afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust rose behind the horse like a plume of smoke. Jasper saw him first and moved to the gate, his stance becoming instantly rigid, watchful. The man pulled his horse up, his face sharp with disdain. "You harboring that widow?" he demanded, his eyes darting past Jasper toward the barn. "Her kin are looking for her, says she belongs with them." Jasper's voice came out low and dangerous. "Belonging don't mean chains. You tell her kin she's not theirs to claim anymore." The rider sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. "We'll see about that." He wheeled his horse around and vanished back down the trail, leaving dust and a palpable threat hanging in the air. Loretta had heard every single word. She stood frozen by the barn door, her baby pressed so tight to her chest the child let out a small whimper. Fear, cold and sharp, blanched the color from her face. When Jasper turned, she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "They'll come again. I should leave. I can't let you carry my burden, too." His eyes, hard and unyielding, locked on hers. "You think I'd hand you back to wolves?" he snarled. "Not while you stand under my roof." Her breath shuddered out of her, a mix of gratitude and terror so potent it left her dizzy. She could only bow her head. "Then I'll work harder," she whispered. "I'll earn every corner of straw you've given us." That night, when she went into the barn, she found something new. A small crib, tucked into the driest corner. It was built from scraps of old wood, the lines rough, the edges uneven. But it was sturdy. It was strong. She traced her fingers over the planed wood, tears stinging her eyes. Jasper never spoke of it, never admitted to the hours of labor. He didn't have to. The act itself spoke louder than any words ever could. When she laid her baby in it, and the child smiled in her sleep, Loretta finally let herself weep, silently, in the dark. She didn't know if this safety would last, but for the first time in so long, a tiny seed of hope began to seep into her weary bones. From the cabin window, Jasper watched the barn glow with the soft light of her lantern. His fists were clenched so tight at his sides his knuckles were white. His heart was betraying him, pounding with a heavy thud he could not silence. He told himself he had done enough. More than enough. Yet he stood there long into the night, a silent, solitary guardian, unwilling to look away. And when the baby's cry rose, faint and lonely through the quiet, his own chest ached with a pain he thought he'd buried for good. But then, as he watched, he saw something else. A flicker of movement at the far end of the property line. It wasn't the rider from before. It was someone else, watching, waiting. And Jasper knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the real storm had not yet arrived. The sky had a harsh, metallic glare the morning the rider returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, their coats caked with dust, their mouths set in cruel thin lines that spoke of a grim certainty. They reined their horses in at Jasper's gate, their very presence an announcement, a challenge meant to shake the very ground beneath the ranch. Loretta saw them from the barn, and her blood ran cold. She froze, her baby clutched tight against her breast, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had known this day would come, had lived in dread of it, yet the reality of it still clawed through her chest like a fresh wound. Jasper was already stepping forward, his stride calm and measured, though she could see the muscle locked in his jaw. He leaned on the gatepost as if it were just another morning, but his eyes burned with an unspoken warning. "You've ridden a long way," he said, his voice perfectly even. "What business keeps you from your own land?" The lead rider's smirk was thin as a razor's edge. "Our business is with the woman. She belongs to her husband's people. It's our right to fetch her back. You've got no claim here, Jasper." Jasper's voice dropped, carrying the weight of stone. "She's no piece of cattle to be fetched. She stays where she chooses to stay." One of the other men spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Folks say you're a fool, Jasper, taking in another man's trouble like that. You think she's worth the stink of gossip? Worth the whole town turning its back on you for good?" Jasper's hand tightened on the wooden rail, his knuckles turning white. "Go back to where you came from," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I won't warn you twice." The riders exchanged looks, a low, cruel rumble of laughter passing between them. But for today, it was just a warning. They turned their horses, kicking up clouds of dirt as they retreated down the long road. Their parting words, however, lingered in the air like smoke. "We'll be back." Loretta stepped out from the barn, trembling so hard she could barely stand. "You can't hold them off forever," she whispered, the words torn from her. "They'll come back with more men. I won't see blood spilled on my account. I have to leave before—" "Enough!" Jasper snapped. The word was so harsh it made her flinch. But then he closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his eyes fixed on hers. His anger, she saw now, wasn't for her. It was for the world that had bruised and battered her. "You think I'll just stand by and watch you walk right into their hands?" he growled. "You and that child will not be driven from this land while I still draw breath." The absolute finality in his words silenced her. She bowed her head, hot tears stinging her lashes, but she swallowed them down before they could fall. "Then I'll find a way to repay it," she murmured, though she had no idea how. That night, Jasper worked late by the light of a single lantern, his hands carving a piece of wood in the quiet stillness. His movements were rough, yet steady, as if every stroke of his knife was a silent vow. When Loretta crept into the barn later to check on her sleeping child, she found a small, sturdy chair placed beside the crib he had built. It was made from the same rough scraps of wood. She ran her hand along its smooth sanded back, her throat tightening with an emotion she couldn't name. No man had ever lifted a finger for her, not without expecting chains in return. "Why?" she whispered into the stillness of the barn. "Why do you trouble yourself with us?" But only the soft, rhythmic breathing of her baby answered. The following days unfolded with a quiet, humming tension that hung heavy over every single gesture. Loretta mended Jasper's worn work shirts, her fingers quick and neat, while he labored in the fields from sunup to sundown, his shoulders slick with sweat. In the small, fleeting moments when they passed each other in the yard, their eyes would meet, and each time, the silence between them deepened, heavy with all the things neither of them dared to name. One afternoon, the baby, now getting bolder, reached out and tugged at Jasper's beard with a tiny, determined fist. Jasper jerked back as though he'd been burned, his face closing up instantly. But that night, through a crack in the barn wall, Loretta glimpsed him staring at his own reflection in a tin mirror, his fingers gently touching the spot on his jaw where the child's tiny hand had been. The gossip in town, predictably, grew louder and uglier. The story spread that Jasper wasn't just harboring the widow, he was keeping her. That she was no better than a stray cat, fattening herself on his pity. Loretta bore it all with her chin held high, but inside, the shame pressed down on her like a millstone. She told herself every single day that she had to be ready to leave, that she would leave before her presence ended up destroying the only man who had ever shown her true decency. Yet every night, when the baby's soft cries filled the barn, she prayed with a desperate heart that he wouldn't be the one to drive them away. Then came the evening when her child, restless with a low fever, simply would not sleep. Loretta paced the length of the barn for hours, rocking her, whispering prayers that frayed and unraveled on her lips. The baby's cries grew more insistent, more distressed. Suddenly, Jasper was there, standing in the doorway, drawn by the sound. He entered without a word. He reached out his large, calloused hands, hesitant, almost clumsy, and took the baby from her arms. Loretta stiffened, watching him, ready to take her back at the slightest sign of trouble. But then she froze in absolute awe. Her daughter, who had been wailing moments before, quieted almost instantly. She settled against Jasper's broad chest, her cheek pressed to his rough shirt, and let out a soft, contented sigh. The sight of it completely undid Loretta. Her knees nearly gave way. Jasper stood as still as a stone statue, as if he were afraid a single breath might break the spell. Slowly, carefully, his hand hovered over the child's tiny back, and then it rested there, steady and impossibly gentle, a shield of protection. Loretta's heart twisted in her chest. She had never seen this man so completely undone, his legendary hardness cracked wide open by something as small and simple as her child's sigh. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep a sob from escaping. He met her gaze across the shadows of the barn, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of them could look away. The silence was fuller and heavier than any speech, carrying a weight that neither of them could bear, yet that neither of them wished to release. When the child was finally deeply asleep, Jasper lowered her gently into the crib he had built. He lingered there, one hand resting on the wooden rail, as though he was reluctant to let go. Loretta stepped forward, her voice a mere whisper in the quiet. "You've given us more than I ever thought the world could hold." His eyes flickered, shadow and flame all at once. "Don't mistake me," he muttered, but his voice for the first time faltered. He turned abruptly, striding out of the barn before she could see the truth that was laid bare on his face. Loretta stood there, clutching the edge of the crib, her heart pounding a wild, unfamiliar rhythm. She knew he was changing. And maybe, just maybe, she was too. The fear hadn't lifted. The riders would come again. The town would sneer louder. But something profound had shifted between them. Something as fragile as glass, but as undeniable as the coming dawn. Outside, Jasper walked the dark yard under a canopy of brilliant stars, his fists clenched at his sides. He had sworn off ties. He had sworn off tenderness. He had built a fortress around his heart stone by stone. But tonight, the simple weight of a baby's breath on his chest had brought the whole thing crashing down. He could no longer pretend indifference. But admitting the truth, even to himself, felt like stepping willingly into a raging fire. The night held its breath, the land silent and waiting, and somewhere out in the deep darkness, the faint, rhythmic sound of hoofbeats echoed, distant for now but closing in. The hoofbeats came at midday, rolling across the silent valley like a drumbeat of war. Dust rose on the horizon, a telltale sign. Soon, the riders appeared. 5 of them this time, their faces grim and set with a violent intent. Loretta's breath caught in her throat. She clutched her daughter so close the child let out a small protest, her own body trembling like a leaf in a high wind. The sun burned down from a cloudless sky, but a deathly chill swept through her veins. Jasper was already in the yard. He didn't have a rifle this time. He just stood there, his stance calm but as taut as a drawn bowstring. He didn't flinch as the riders pulled up to the gate, their horses snorting and stamping the dry earth, their presence a suffocating weight. The leader, the same man from before, leaned forward on his saddle, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. He spat into the dirt. "We warned you, Jasper," he called out, his tone sharp as barbed wire. "That widow's ours to claim. We're done talking. Step aside." Jasper's voice carried back, clear and hard as iron striking stone. "She belongs to no man but herself, and as long as she stands on this land, she stands under my protection." "You want her," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "You'll have to go through me." The words cut through the air like a blade. The riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, glancing at one another. This wasn't the response they had expected. One of them, bolder than the rest, nudged his horse forward, his hand drifting down toward the pistol holstered at his hip. Loretta's heart hammered so loudly she was sure they could hear it clear across the yard. She whispered desperate, frantic prayers into her baby's soft hair, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. The infant stirred in her arms, but, strangely, did not cry, as though even she could feel the crushing weight of the silence. The entire valley seemed to be holding its breath. There was no birdsong, no whisper of a breeze, only the thick, suffocating promise of violence hanging by a single frayed thread. That's when Loretta saw it. Jasper wasn't just standing there. In his right hand, held down by his side, almost hidden, was a stick of dynamite. A short fuse was already sticking out of the top. Her eyes went wide with terror and a sudden, shocking understanding. Jasper raised his left hand slowly, showing it was empty. His scarred jaw was a hard granite line. "Take one more step," he said, his voice now so low it could have chilled the blood on a summer day. "And we all get to taste dust before sundown. Your choice." The moment stretched, long enough to break a man's courage into 1,000 pieces. The rider with his hand on his gun stared at the dynamite, then at Jasper's face, a face that held not a flicker of fear or doubt. Finally, the leader sneered, though the edge of raw fear had touched his eyes. He spat again, his glare as sharp and ugly as broken glass. "This isn't over." They wheeled their horses around, muttering curses, their rage and humiliation simmering in the dust they kicked up as they galloped away. And then the valley was quiet again. Loretta sagged against the barn post, relief so powerful it was like being hit by a physical wave. It flooded her, leaving her weak and shaking, tears finally blurring her vision. Her body shook, half from the lingering terror, half from a gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. When Jasper turned back toward her, the stick of dynamite still in his hand, she whispered, her voice trembling, "You risked your life, for us. I have nothing to give you in return." He strode toward her, his heavy boots striking the dirt with purpose. His face was still hard, still unyielding, but in his eyes something flickered. Something raw and unguarded, something almost painful in its stark honesty. He stopped just before her, his tall frame casting a shadow over both mother and child. His voice came out rough, as if it were dragged up from a place he had buried long and deep. "You're wrong," he said. "You gave me back my heart." Loretta blinked, stunned into silence, sure she had misheard him. "I swore I'd never care about anything again," he continued, his chest rising and falling sharply with the force of his words. "I was a dead man walking. But you and this child, you gave me something worth waking up for. Something worth fighting for. I won't let you go, Loretta." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She saw the truth of it etched into every line on his face. The vast, crushing loneliness that had carved him hollow, now suddenly filled with something fierce and undeniable that he could no longer hide. Her own eyes brimmed with tears as she did the only thing that felt right. She carefully placed her daughter into his arms. The baby settled there easily, naturally, her tiny breath rising against his chest, as though she had always belonged there. Loretta whispered, her voice finally breaking, "Then we are yours. If you'll have us." Jasper's arms, the same arms that could split a log with one blow, tightened around the child with an infinite gentleness. His gaze, fierce and protective, locked with hers. and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice softened, carrying not the sharp edge of steel, but the unbreakable strength of devotion. "I love you, Loretta," he said, the words simple, honest, and true. "I reckon I've loved you since the moment you stood in my yard and begged me for nothing more than a corner of straw." The baby sighed in her sleep, her small hand clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. Loretta reached out, her fingers trembling as they found his. And there, in that quiet, dusty yard, with the threat finally driven back, a family was born, not of blood, but of courage and choice. And that, my friend, is how love can sometimes bloom in the most unlikeliest of places, in the dust and the desperation. It found a woman who had been cast out, a man who had been hardened by sorrow, and a tiny child who somehow managed to bind them both together. It just goes to show you, sometimes the home we ache for isn't a place at all, but the people who are willing to stand their ground and fight for us. Before you go, do me a favor and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? I'd really love to know. And if this story touched your heart, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more tales, and click on the next story that's waiting for you right on the screen.